Okay, well, it's my great pleasure to welcome everyone back to the SciAm Financial Maths and Engineering virtual seminar series. This month we've got Ryan Donnelly from King's College London, who's kindly agreed to speak to us about dynamic inventory management with mean field competition. If there are any questions, please either raise your hand or put them in the chat or the Q&A as you're able. Otherwise, we'll keep most of the questions to the end. But if there's anything as we go along, do feel free to use those mechanisms. Ryan, you've gone now.
All right, great. Thanks very much. So thank you for the invitation, Sam. It's always great to participate in this kind of stuff with the community. And it's great to see a lot of familiar faces, or in this online setting, at least familiar names in the participants list. So this is joint work with my PhD student, Z Lee, or Sylvia, as she goes by. I don't think she's attending here. She's on a holiday back home, but she's given this talk a couple times. And so, any questions you have, direct them at me. I'm sure I'll be able to answer them. But when it comes to some of the really technical specifics of the numerical algorithm, for example, I might have to get back to you on that after speaking with Sylvia. So a little bit of background on what kind of problem we're going to be looking at here. Dynamic inventory pricing models can be used to figure out optimal pricing strategies for perishable products. So we want to think of perishable products as being things that have to be sold by some time, which we'll be denoting by capital T. So if you want to think of a specific example in the back of your mind, you might think about selling airline tickets. Tickets to a specific flight have to be sold by the time the flight departs, of course. Anything that's left over, any inventory left over after the flight takes off, expires useless, essentially. So the optimal pricing strategy could depend on several different factors. For example, the amount of time that's remaining until the flight departs, the number of tickets that are remaining in the inventory of the airline, and of course, the trade-off between setting a very large price, meaning that the frequency of sales will be low, versus setting a low price, meaning and the frequency of sales will be high. Obviously, you like the prices to be large so that the revenue generated per sale is higher. But if you're selling things less frequently, then this is going to cause a trade-off so that prices aren't going to be extremely large. So other industries where this type of thing, these types of models are relevant are in hotel and tourism industry areas and in seasonal fashion. So some of the references that I'm going to go through for literature that's been done in this work in this area previously, some of the papers had authors that actually worked alongside fashion companies to determine production and pricing strategies. And a couple of the papers are specifically geared towards airline ticket sales. So these types of models are somewhat well established for these types of problems. So some examples of work that's been done in a monopolistic market. This paper by Gallego and Van Ryzen, when I got into this type of work, this paper was explained to me as the Black-Scholes of dynamic inventory pricing. So it's basically a very straightforward version, a single agent version of the model that we're going to be looking at today. And this is the one where the authors had worked with some fashion companies in determining production and sales strategies. The second paper here is a similar type of work, but sort of specifically geared towards the airline industry. The thing these have in common is that they're both in the context of a single agent trying to maximize total revenue. So some further work has been done in competitive markets where multiple agents are concerned. the first paper here, Dr. Jorgensen, again, kind of similar, basically a straight generalization of what's been done in these first two papers, except with multiple agents, except they have a simplifying model where everything is actually deterministic. So they don't have stochastic demand. Sales occur according to some deterministic model. Gallego and Hu is more or less a direct generalization of the first paper I mentioned by Gallego and Van Ryzen. Multiple agents selling a perishable asset, and they establish some conditions for when they have an equilibrium amongst multiple agents. What we're going to do today is probably most similar to this work here, Yang and Chia. They do also dynamic pricing with a mean field interaction between agents, but many aspects of the dynamics they consider are somewhat simplified, especially when it comes to pricing strategies that agents are allowed to choose. So in particular, they only consider two possible prices to set for the asset. They can either set a high price or a low price. So we're going to look at the possibility that agents can quote from a continuous set of prices. The model that we're going to look at or develop here is very similar of a lot of models that have been used in the context of algorithmic trading. So some of the papers here, some of the authors' names certainly we're familiar with. In the context of market making, the models in these three papers are quite similar. Some differences between them. They may consider different goals of the agents, but the dynamics behind all these models are very similar to each other. And they consider what's kind of like a two-sided version of the problem that we're going to look at, or the model we're going to look at, where an agent can both buy and sell the asset. And what we're doing, we're only going to allow the agent to sell the asset. So it's probably going to be more similar to the work done down here, where in this context of algorithmic trading, an agent has some number of shares of financial asset that they need to liquidate by the end of the day, and they're doing so with limit orders. So they're quoting a price, and the frequency at which their sales occur is going to depend on the price that they quote. Okay, let's start to look a little bit more in detail at the actual model that we're going to consider. I'm going to start with an M agent game. So we have a finite number of agents, and eventually we'll take M to infinity, and we can consider things in a mean field setting. We're going to say they're all holding capital Q upper bar units of some product, and they want to sell this before time capital T. It's not completely necessary that they all hold the same initial inventory. We could change this if we wanted to. And I can point out when we get to the mean field setting how that affects the mean field dynamics, or the initial conditions of the mean field model. But it's not completely necessary that they're all holding the same amount. We're just doing this now for convenience. The agents all observe a reference price, which for simplicity, we set this equal to a Brownian martingale. And each agent, which at the moment we'll denote with an index I, they're going to quote a spread price, which we'll denote by delta I, so that at time T, the price that they are offering to sell the inventory at, a single unit of inventory, is ST plus delta T. It'll be useful to also denote the average across all agents of the price that they're quoting. And we're going to denote that by delta bar. So delta bar is just the sum of all of these over the different i's divided by M. We're going to keep track of how many units an individual agent has sold, and we'll denote that by capital N. So the number of units sold by agent I, it will depend on the pricing strategy that is chosen by agent I, and it's also going to depend on the average pricing strategy across all agents. And the way that this is going to come into play, this dependence is going to be through the intensity of the sales. Now, we've chosen this intensity to depend on the mean of delta, the mean of all of these pricing strategies. We could have a more general quantity go in here, essentially anything that depends on the entire distribution of all the deltas, right? Every agent is choosing potentially a different value of delta I. And so we have a distribution of prices, and we could put any kind of dependence on the law or the distribution of these deltas in here. We've chosen the mean somewhat for simplicity. This intensity function satisfies some dependencies on the distribution of prices, which make economic sense. And given that we resort to solving things numerically for the most part anyway, it wouldn't be too difficult to put something else in there. But we're pretty sure that essentially any reasonable choice of dependence on the whole distribution of strategies won't change the qualitative behavior of the equilibrium in the end. So we've just elected to put the mean spread in there.
So, Ryan?
Yes.
Would you have trouble with continuity, etc., if you put the best price in there? Because that's somehow extreme and in some senses discontinuous.
Yeah, so this is always the first thing that people ask about, right? In that case, I'll admit it's possible that we have some kind of problem with stability or something like that. I really don't know. So Sylvia, my PhD student, has been working on a bit of a follow-up project which tries to take that into account, where if you have several agents quoting prices in a super competitive market, only the agents quoting the lowest price will actually get filled in a fully competitive market, right? But in some industries, this isn't exactly what happens. Now, we could argue that you could come back and say that a flight from London to Toronto on Air Canada is different from a flight from London to Toronto on British Airways, right? I grant that they are different things, but different people have different preferences for companies, or in this case, agents that they might prefer to buy from. And so we're kind of meshing that into this general intensity function. What do people do when they're actually booking a hotel or booking a flight to a particular city? They might look at these days Google Flights and get a sense of what typical prices are, but they're not going to instantly go for the lowest one. Well, sometimes they will, sometimes they won't. Some people have loyalty to certain airlines. Some people prefer to fly at this time of day versus that time of day. Again, we could argue that these are different products and shouldn't be considered in the same model, but this is what we're going to go for at the moment. But yeah, Sylvia has been working on things where the ordering of prices actually does matter, and lowest prices kind of get a priority. So we had previously, the last thing I said is we're keeping track of the number of units that each agent has sold. And this is going to be, competition comes in through the intensity, which depends on not only a particular agent's pricing strategy, but also the average of all prices set by all agents. Okay, we'll denote one agent's pricing strategy, or one agent's inventory by capital Q. Again, it'll depend on their own strategy as well as the average. And the dynamics of Q are set to this. Anytime a sale occurs, the inventory decreases by 1. We have an indicator function here because as soon as an agent hits 0 inventory, they exit the game. Okay, so once they've liquidated their position, they have no inventory left. Their inventory doesn't change anymore, and they also will no longer impact the average market dynamics. Cash process for any agent is going to be denoted by capital X. Similar to the inventory, it changes when a sale occurs. So when this DN sort of fires off, we'll get a change in cash. And the amount that the cash changes by is going to be S plus delta. So this is the price that they are quoting at any point in time. And once again, this only changes if they are holding non-zero inventory. Performance criterion is essentially going to maximize their total expected wealth. So the wealth is going to be the sum of how much cash they've generated through time, plus what is called a recovery price in some sense. Okay, so they might have some kind of leftover inventory Q, and they can sell that off at this reference price S, subject to a penalty, depending on how much they might have left over. This running penalty term is simply, we can think of this as a risk control. So a large value of phi will create more urgency to the agents, and they're going to change their prices so that they tend to sell faster because they don't want to hold on to inventory through time. Okay, we're not going to study the model in the finite version play of the game. We're directly going to study the model in the limit as m goes to infinity. So what we need to do now is kind of figure out how all these dynamics for the finite agent model, kind of what happens to these dynamics in the infinite agent model. So we're going to talk now about a representative agent. We're not going to be labeling agents with different indices I. We're going to talk about some kind of abstract representative agent. And we're going to assume that they choose their spread, their pricing strategy, according to some function f, where f is a function of time and their remaining inventory. Okay, so throughout we'll denote delta superscript f to be the pricing strategy which results when they choose the feedback form of their price according to the function f. It's also going to be useful to keep track of the proportion of all agents that are holding a particular level of inventory. So if I let lowercase q be some number between 0 and capital Q, then I can talk about what percentage of all agents hold an inventory of lowercase q. Okay, so we'll denote that by a capital P. So this quantity here, this summation that we're taking to a limit, this is exactly, this finite sum is exactly the number of agents that have an inventory equal to lowercase q at time t. And if we take a limit as m approaches infinity, then in the infinite agent version of the game, this is the proportion of all agents that hold inventory little q. And this is equal to the probability that one particular agent, so one representative agent, has that level of inventory. So this line here, this bottom line, is just in the context of mean field dynamics, this is the propagation of chaos. So it's saying that the law of Q, which is this last quantity on the right, the law of the inventory process Q is equal to the limit of the proportion of agents in the finite player game that hold inventory Q. Okay, so the next thing we want to do is we want to figure out what are the dynamics of this process P, or we want to not figure out, but write down the dynamics of this process P, because this quantity P, along with the feedback strategy delta, will determine delta bar. Okay, if I know what proportion of agents are at every inventory level, and if I know what the pricing strategy is according to the inventory level, then I can use these two things together to compute what the average spread is that's being quoted in the market at any point in time. Okay, so this here at the top, this is the average spread quoted across all agents. Okay, we just take, for every value of inventory, for every possible value of Q, we take the price that is being set by an agent at that inventory level, multiply it by the proportion of all agents at that inventory level, and add this together, add this up over all inventory levels. Now, we divide out by this quantity here to normalize, because agents that have liquidated their position completely are no longer in the game. They've exited the game, they've exited the market. And so this quantity here, this P sub 0, this is the number or the mass of agents that are no longer quoting in the market. So we have to subtract those in order to normalize and get a proper mean price. Okay, and lastly, the last sort of thing that really goes into this before we can do some computations and analysis are the dynamics of each of these processes P sub Q. So all these proportion processes. So to explain where these come from, it's easiest to start at the top one. So capital P subscript Q upper bar. This is the percentage of agents that are holding their initial inventory level. They haven't sold anything yet, okay? And in the infinite player version of the game, this process is, of course, going to decrease, right? At time 0, everyone is holding the maximum inventory. And through time, these agents are going to be selling inventory. And so agents are exiting this state at some rate. Now, what rate are they exiting that state from? Well, they're exiting according to the frequency of the sales. So lambda. Now, like an individual agent is leaving at a rate of lambda. And so the entire population of agents is leaving this at a rate lambda times the current size of the population of agents in that state. And then if we go down to an arbitrary value of Q, well, there's an influx of agents that are entering that state because they have sold out of the Q plus 1 state into the Q state. So that's what this term is here. And there's also agents that are leaving the Q state because they have sold a share and they no longer hold Q inventory, they hold Q minus 1 inventory. And so that's this term here, okay? So this middle equation is the one that holds for all values of Q that are a non-zero and less than the initial inventory level. And then, of course, agents, this last quantity represents the rate at which agents are leaving the game. So the only way you leave the game is you hold one inventory and then you end up selling your final unit of inventory. And so across the entire population, this is the rate at which this happens. So we've set initial conditions here for these processes P. We said that for Q upper bar, the initial value of the process is 1. And for all other values of Q, the initial value of the process is 0. Again, this just goes back to the fact that basically for simplicity, we're saying that all agents start with the same initial inventory level. We could change that, and that would just change what the initial condition of this process is. But once you fix a feedback form of the strategy F, this entire proportions process becomes deterministic. So it doesn't really, there's nothing too special about this starting inventory distribution. We could make this anything we want. So this set of equations on the bottom half of the slide here, these are just the Kolmogorov forward equations corresponding to this model in the mean field setting. All right. So what is the type of equilibrium that we're looking for? So I've written up here again, I've just rewritten the performance criterion so we can see that the performance criterion will depend on, it depends on two inputs essentially. So if I assume a fixed process delta bar, so if I fix the average price that is quoted throughout the entire market, and we imagine that we can that a representative agent knows what the average price process is going to be, then their performance is only going to depend on the pricing strategy that they choose, delta F. Okay, so what we're looking for is we're looking for a function F, which is basically the feedback the feedback form of the pricing strategy such that two things happen. The first is we need some kind of sense of optimality, and we need some kind of notion of consistency. Okay, so what's going on here is let's choose some function f. If I choose f, this determines a pricing strategy that a representative agent is using, and we assume now that all agents are using the same feedback version of the strategy. That function f is going to give rise to a particular mean spread process. Okay, and if that mean spread process is the one that is assumed to actually realize, then we need that the feedback form of the strategy dictated by f is the one that's optimal. Okay, so the two conditions we need here are it's the natural generalization of a finite player Nash equilibrium, where if you fix the strategies of all other agents, then each individual agent has to be acting optimally. But the difference here is that rather than fixing every single other agent individually, you fix the mean. In this case, you fix the mean price that happens to be quoted by every other agent. And what you need is that the function that becomes optimal in that setting is also the function which gives rise to that mean spread in the first place. Okay, so this is the notion of equilibrium that we're looking for. In order to do any kind of computations, we're going to need a particular version of the intensity function. So if we ignore this second part here, if we just look at the exponential of negative kappa times delta, that's a very common form of this intensity function to use in these styles of problem, both in the inventory management and the algorithmic trading context, just because largely for computational reasons, it's extremely convenient. And so we wanted to sort of not change this too much to hopefully the computations would remain somewhat tractable. But what we've added is a competition effect, which essentially the way it comes in here is if the price that a particular agent is quoting is lower than the average price in the market, then this intensity will be larger, and vice versa. So if the price that an individual agent sets is greater than the average that's seen in the market, then their intensity will be lower than some kind of benchmark. Okay, so this parameter beta represents to some extent the magnitude of this competitive interaction. And again, the competitive interaction only comes in through the intensity of the sales. Okay. So if we fix a deterministic mean spread process delta bar, then we just end up with a standard optimization problem, a standard dynamic optimization problem. When the mean spread is fixed, all we're looking for now is the pricing strategy for a representative agent. So there's an associated Hamilton-Jacobi-Bellman equation to this. I won't go through too many of the details here, but there's a nice ansatz, the excess value ansatz applies here. And we can write down, this is a system of ODEs, and we can prove that this equation has a unique classical solution, and the optimal strategy in feedback form is given by this expression here. Okay, so it's the HJB equation reduces to a system of ODEs, and I say a system because for every value of Q between 1 and capital Q, we just have a different ODE, but they are of course coupled together through this term here. Okay, now this strategy here, this delta star, this is the optimal strategy in feedback form, but for a particular deterministic delta bar. Okay, So this only satisfies the optimality part of the equilibrium. We still have to worry about the consistency. So we solve things numerically, and there's a fairly natural thing that you would try when looking for a fixed point in this type of problem, and is just to iterate the forward dynamics and the backward dynamics over and over. Okay, so I'll walk very briefly through the algorithm that we use to do this. We start with an arbitrary function of time, which is to represent an initial guess for this delta bar process. Now, given an arbitrary delta bar, we can use what's on the previous slide to compute delta star. Okay, delta star, really it's nothing more than we compute some function, which is the feedback representation of delta star. Okay, so given a delta bar, we can compute delta star. But given a delta star, you can compute then this proportions process. You can compute, if you know the strategy that every agent is using, you can compute the proportion of agents in any state through time. Remember, we had a system of differential equations forward in time that this process capital P satisfies. So now we have that. And once we have this proportion process along with the optimal strategy delta star, we can update this mean quote process. So this last term here is essentially the updated version of the mean spread. And we just factor this in with a learning rate parameter. And we run this over and over, steps 2 to 4, hoping that we get some kind of convergence. Now, we haven't been able to prove existence or uniqueness or anything like that of the mean field Nash equilibrium. But what I will say is that for every set of parameters we've looked at, this algorithm will always converge to a unique set of strategies. And not only that, we've never been able to make it converge to different things depending on the initial guess. So even if the initial process that we input into this algorithm is white noise, it'll always converge to the same thing. So it's not a proof of existence or uniqueness. And the convergence is also very fast. It's extremely quick. It's to a very, very low numerical tolerance. The algorithm only has to loop through, on the order of single-digit number of times. So it's an extremely quick convergence. It's not a proof of existence or uniqueness of an equilibrium, but it's pretty convincing evidence, I think, that we can start looking at what these strategies look like and kind of talk about it as the equilibrium. Okay, this is just a graphical illustration of how this algorithm works, kind of shows the sequence of steps and what depends on what. And we're basically just looking for a fixed point in this delta bar process. Okay, so this is what the optimal or the equilibrium strategies look like in feedback form. There are a couple of things here that should look somewhat familiar if you have done anything in this type of dynamic inventory management or algorithmic trading. In particular, as the remaining inventory goes down, the quoted price goes up. This is mostly a reflection of the urgency of agents to liquidate their shares. When you have a large number of shares remaining or a large number of units remaining, so Q is large, you're incentivized to set a low price in order to avoid the riskiness associated with price changes and also the possibility of your inventory expiring worthless or subject to some kind of penalty. Okay. Now, if you've looked at figures like this a lot in the single agent case and compared to the multi-agent case, there are some subtle differences, but I don't think I have time to go into them too much. What I'd rather do is kind of look at the effects of competition and so on. Also, we can plot what the average spread quoted by agents looks like through time. So of course it starts at something very low, because at time 0, everybody is quoting this price because everybody is in the maximum inventory level. But then through time, a representative agent will jump up to this next inventory level. And of course, across the population, there's like a flow of agents into smaller inventory levels. And so the average price quoted in the market is going to go up. And maybe an interesting feature to see is that at some intermediate time before the expiry of the problem, there is a maximum quoted price in the market. So this could potentially be a reflection of some things we see in real markets. There are sometimes early bird sales on certain things. As soon as a product first opens up for sale, sometimes it might be very cheap, like some kind of early bird sale. And there may also be some sort of last minute liquidation panic, right? Again, you can think of airlines, depending on exactly what you consider to be last minute, and depending on what their the remaining inventory is of a particular airline. Sometimes they are desperate to get rid of their terminal inventory. Okay, so what we have here, I've plotted the feedback strategies in equilibrium, but this is for 2 different values of the competition parameter. So remember, in the intensity function, there was a parameter beta, which is supposed to capture the magnitude of the effect of competition. And we're just plotting it for 2 different values of beta here, okay? So the solid curves are exactly the same as what we had on the previous slide. And the dotted curves are the resulting equilibrium strategies with a larger value of competition. So the interesting thing that we see here is that there is not a uniform, at least in qualitative sense, there's not a uniform change made to the equilibrium strategies when the competition increases. And what I mean by that is, well, let's look at when the remaining inventory is 1. Well, when the remaining inventory is 1, when the competition parameter goes up, all of the prices go down. So there's like qualitatively, the direction of the change is uniform. But if we look at the maximum inventory level, sometimes when the competition parameter increases, sometimes prices decrease, but sometimes the optimal strategy is to increase the price. Now, this is not, keep in mind, this is a feedback form of the strategy, right? Just because it looks like higher competition has increased prices in this state, but that's only for agents who are in the max, who have not made a single sale yet. So even though in this particular state, the price might increase, when you look at the entire market, or where you look at the population, the distribution of prices quoted, that's not necessarily going to be the case, okay? And in fact, what we see is kind of much more what's expected. So on the left, what we have, again, solid and dotted lines represent a low amount of competition and a high amount of competition. And this is a plot of the average spread, which is quoted through time, depending on these 2 competition levels. And we do now see, a monotonic decrease as the competition increases, which is a little bit more economically sensible. But it's still interesting to see that on an individual agent level, at the representative agent level, you don't always just uniformly decrease prices if the competition is more extreme. Okay, I'll briefly mention what's on the right here. On the right is this proportion process. It's the terminal value of this proportion process. So the size of each bar represents the proportion of agents that finish in each state. So if we look at the proportion of agents that fully liquidate, those are the ones that end up with 0. With more competition, we end up with more agents ending up, fully selling off all of their inventory. Okay, I'm going to come back to ideas related to that later when we look at some other things. Okay, the next thing I want to look at, kind of what the point of this work was, and where things I think start to get really interesting. We're going to look at certain economic quantities of interest. You can think of these as social economic variables, perhaps. So let me explain how these are computed and what they represent. So we're calling the first one cumulative volume. This represents the total mass of inventory that moves from the sellers to the buyers. So in the original version of the model with finite player, everything was very discrete, and individual units of the asset would move from the seller to the buyer. But when you have an infinite number of agents all holding capital Q units of the asset, you can't really talk about individual units that move, but you can talk about like a flow of the mass of inventory that moves from sellers to buyers. Okay, so this quantity represents the total cumulative volume of assets that move from sellers to buyers. And the way these are computed is by just taking a quantity which represents how fast sales are occurring, right? This quantity here in the integrand is familiar. This is the speed at which agents that are currently holding Q shares are selling. This is how fast all of the agents in state Q are leaving state Q. And that's exactly what it means. Like that's exactly how fast agents are selling out of state Q. And if you integrate this from time 0 to t, this gives the total flow of inventory out of state Q. And then if you just add this up over all possible values of inventory Q, then you get the total number, or you get the total cumulative flow of inventory that has occurred from time 0 to capital T, or 0 to little t, the way it's written here. Okay. You could also write down an expression for the cumulative cost. So this represents the total amount of cash which flows from the buyers to the sellers. So it's essentially the same expression as above, but the speed of selling here is multiplied by the magnitude, the price of the sale. Okay, so the cumulative amount of cash that moves from the pockets of buyers into the pockets of sellers over the course of the entire trading period is represented by this whole thing. Okay, a couple more interesting quantities to look at are going to be the average transaction cost that occurs up to time t. Well, this is just going to be the total cost that has been spent up to time t divided by the total volume that has been spent up to time t, and also the instantaneous average transaction cost. So we're looking at the derivative of the cost function divided by the derivative of the volume function. And this, another way you can think of this is at any one time t, there's a distribution of prices that are quoted in the market, and different prices have different probabilities that they are the next unit sold, because of the, different prices will give rise to different intensity functions. And so if you know that a sale happens at time t, but you don't know exactly where it's going to happen, you can look at the intensity functions and figure out what is the distribution of the price at which that sale will actually happen. This represents the average across that distribution. Okay, so if you were some sort of market observer and you were looking at all transactions that happened through time, and if you fixed one point in time and looked at all of the transactions that happened at that one point in time, this would be the average of the prices of those transactions at that one point in time. Whereas this quantity, capital K, represents the average that have happened of all transactions up to that time. Okay, so we want to look at how all of these quantities depend on this competition parameter. So, the total cost. So the amount of cash that flows from buyers to sellers actually decreases. The average cost up to time t and the average instantaneous cost at time t also decrease as competition increases. Perhaps something interesting to see is, again, this K bar has the familiar shape that it looks very similar to delta bar. They're not exactly the same. Delta bar is the average that's quoted, but K bar is the average that's actually transacted. But it looks like competition, increased competition decreases these.
Sorry,
on the other hand,
you had a question in the Q&A. What is V?
Yeah, I see the question. Should I take the questions as we go? What is V?
As you wish.
Yeah, so V is, here we have V. V represents the total volume of inventory that is sold by all agents up to time t. Okay, so if every single agent ended up selling every single one of their units of the asset at time capital T, then these curves would actually end up at 5. Okay, but not every agent is going to sell everything. Some agents will only end up selling 4 of them. Some will only end up selling 3. So this V represents the total mass of inventory that has been sold through time. Okay, and so we see here that these competition parameters, they also change things in maybe not uniform ways, or maybe ways that are not expected. So when competition goes up, we saw in the previous slide, if I go back to the previous slide, that the total cost or the total amount of cash that moves from the buyers to sellers, it decreases with more competition. But the total volume of units that are transacted increases with more competition. So, I mean, this is an interesting thing to look at. The real thing that I kind of want to get into is the effect of overselling. So I'm surprised no one actually said anything about this. As soon as I say, think of airline tickets as being a concrete example in your mind of what you should think of, I often get questions about, well, why is inventory bounded below by 0? Aren't airlines allowed to go into negative inventory? So yes. So depending on the industry, depending on the geographical location, there are different regulations about what you're allowed to do. And we are interested in figuring out, especially when it comes to these socially economic variables, how does the ability to oversell change what we saw there? Okay, so how does the ability to oversell change these economic variables? So what we've done here is we've modified briefly the performance criterion. Essentially, we treat negative inventory different from positive inventory, both in terms of the terminal penalty we have here and in terms of the running risk penalty. Okay, so the overall problem is essentially the same. The dynamics of everything are the same. We just, agents do not exit the game when they hit 0. They exit the game when they hit some negative lower bound. And we see here what happens to the feedback form of the strategies. So these figures are a little bit misleading because the red curves are the same on the left and right. It's just a different vertical scale that we have here. The red curves represent the feedback strategies when overselling is not allowed. So they're the same feedback strategies we saw previously. And then on one side, on the left, the dotted green curve represent the new equilibrium strategies when you are allowed to oversell and there's a low penalty to doing so. On the right-hand side, you're again allowed to oversell, but there is a high penalty to do so. So you can see there are drastic differences between what happens in equilibrium depending on whether the penalties of overselling are mild or severe. Okay, so we can again investigate these economic quantities again. The only change here is that again, the lower bound is no longer 1. The lower bound is 1 greater than the inventory target, essentially. And we see some interesting things happen here to these economic variables. What I'm going to do is I'm going to skip to the one that I think is most interesting, which is this. So capital K, remember, capital K represents the average price paid for the asset through time across all transactions, okay? So this is the cumulative average price paid after the problem has completely finished, all right? So the thing that's interesting here is especially the terminal value. The red curve represents the situation when overselling is not allowed. The green curve, the dotted green curve, represents the situation where overselling is allowed and there's a low penalty. And the blue curve represents a high penalty to overselling. So basically what we see here is that, you know, these two curves, the red and the green, they end up at exactly, well, not exactly, but they end up sufficiently close to each other that you can't really tell the difference. So basically what this is saying is that if regulatory penalties to overselling are chosen in a particular way, then the average price that is bared by the consumer will be the same, whether there's overselling or not. So, you know, the average price that the consumer pays is something that they would be interested in. That would be something they want it to be low, right? And so we see that these parameters can be chosen in such a way that the buyers, which in this version of the problem, the buyers are not acting strategically, but we just assume there's a large enough mass of them, I suppose. The buyers are indifferent to whether there is overselling or not, as long as the parameters are chosen in a particular way. Now, this may not be the only thing that they are interested in. They may also be interested in other things that we can look at. For example, what is the probability that you as an individual were a person that is the victim of overselling? Or what is the probability that you show up to your airport or hotel and you find that you've been overbooked? So we can write down an expression which represents the probability that you are one of these unlucky individuals. And we can investigate what this looks like as a function of the competitiveness parameter, beta, or as a function of one of these overselling penalty parameters, alpha. And you have a dependence, you have a clear dependence on what these two things are doing. And all of these types of quantities, along with the social economic quantities, could be used to tailor the harshness or the severity of these penalties so that the buyers are either indifferent or even maybe favorable to the existence of overselling, depending on what the preferences are of an arbitrary person in the population. Okay, so that's all I've got to say. It's a very brief conclusion. We've formulated a mean field model for dynamic inventory problem. We resorted to numerical computations to compute equilibrium. So like I said before, we've never found a case for a fixed set of parameters. We've never found a case where the equilibrium strategies are unstable or anything like that. They always end up converging to the same thing. And for multiple different sets of parameters, that statement holds. So while we don't have a proof for existence or uniqueness of the equilibrium, it's pretty convincing evidence that, especially given how quickly it converges, it's pretty convincing evidence that it is an equilibrium. And I think the interesting thing that we looked at as a result of what happens in equilibrium, especially where some things that are not necessarily completely intuitive happening, is looking at the effect of competition and overselling on these variables that represent economic welfare. They could potentially be used to dictate regulatory policy in different industries, depending on, to try and ensure that everyone is somewhat happy with the result. Sellers want to make a high revenue. Buyers want to balance the fact that they're paying low prices, but also don't want to have a high probability of being oversold to. That's it. And I guess we have time for some questions. There's something written in the chat already. I didn't take a look at this. Oh, it's just Sam.
So, thank you, Ryan. There is time for questions. If anyone wants to ask a question, please raise your hand. Otherwise, I was wondering, Ryan, have you thought about what happens when buyers act somehow strategically? If I know that...
Yeah, your first question about low price priority, the problem that Sylvia's been working on is incorporating that and strategic behavior by buyers. Yeah, so it's, as you can imagine, a lot more difficult. And even resorting to numerical stuff in a very simple one-time step thing, a lot of things end up just collapsing to something trivial, like, well, everyone posts price of 0, right? Because then everyone buys at that price. Yeah, so we're still trying to figure out a tractable way of setting up a problem like this that doesn't result in completely trivial equilibrium.
Also, have you thought about non-Markov Nash equilibria at all?
No. So the reason we've restricted the strategies to be feedback of this form, it really came from motivation of from the single agent version of this problem. In the single agent version, it's completely expected that the strategy will depend only on time and their current inventory. And so we just said, well, let's just impose as a restriction in the mean field setting that they do the same thing. So
because that excludes a lot of your collusive type behavior and this type of thing as well.
I mean, not necessarily. I suppose. I mean, we do not see anything. We certainly don't see anything that could potentially be interpreted as collusion. And the other thing we're doing is we're also forcing everyone. We're looking for an equilibrium where everyone is using the same feedback form, right? I suppose maybe you're asking, maybe half the population uses one feedback form and half the population uses another. You could still have an equilibrium in that way. Although if the distribution of agents, if the population flow is deterministic, then then you can't have this kind of mixed equilibrium thing. It will be of the form that we have. So you would need some kind of stochastic dependence on the measure flow to get some kind of to get something like what you're asking about. So again, it's also possible that equilibria exist that have that feature. We have thrown that ability out the window altogether, right? So what we have, it is an equilibrium, but it's certainly, and it looks to be, the numerical evidence seems to suggest that it's the only equilibrium where the measure flow is deterministic. If you believe that our numerical algorithm is converging nicely the way we say, then it's good evidence that it's the only equilibrium with a deterministic measure flow. But we're not even looking at equilibria with a stochastic measure flow.
Yeah, well, of the Markov type, certainly. So I'm thinking that you could have price war type models where it would depend if you've been quoting too much lower than me, then I change in response to this, and you can end up with
Yeah,
different
this is
criteria for this.
I'm trying to think. I mean, when you say you and me, in some sense, in a mean field setting, that doesn't really make sense, right? But
sure.
Yeah, maybe there's something you could tack on to the finite agent game and see what happens in the limit. No, we haven't considered that. We basically looked at all the work that had been established in one agent and just said, let's keep things in the same setting and see what happens. Yeah, but you're right. It's definitely not necessarily the end of the story. There could be a lot of stuff going on even within this model. There could be stuff that is possible that we're ignoring by putting this restriction on the strategies.